Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today, let's go not too far. We're going off to the area of Guelph and Waterloo, where my guests all work, and we're going to talk about the ethics and the international law concerning geoengineering, or if we want to avoid that term, other technologies such as how to restore the climate to pre-industrial times. And so I'm glad to welcome three professors who already know each other and have probably talked about these issues many times in the past. But this, by the way, is the first in a series of 35 different forums that Project Save the World is organizing and will host over the next 8 months, so that we can discuss many variations and considerations about the use of technologies to manage our climate, and especially with respect to the polar regions, the Arctic and the Antarctic, which are warming at a phenomenal rate and puzzling everybody about how such a thing is possible. So we have three guests here, and it will be my pleasure to talk to them about this. Simon Dalby is a professor emeritus at Wilfrid Laurier University, and he's on the faculty of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and he's worked primarily in areas about environmental security and geopolitics. Byron Williston is a professor at Laurier in philosophy, and as is appropriate for a philosopher, he is concerned about the ethics of climate change and the technologies for managing it. Neil Craig is a professor at the University of Waterloo School of the Environment, Enterprise and Development, which is an interesting combination of concerns. And he, of course, is familiar with and very engaged in work on climate and governance. So welcome, all of you. Neil, would you be so good as to start us off? I think you want to talk a little bit about the ethical issues, and that requires some definition about what we mean by geoengineering.
Sure. Yeah. So I can start with just defining some of these terms, just so we're clear about what we're talking about. And so the umbrella term climate geoengineering, sometimes referred to as climate interventions, typically has sort of two baskets of technologies. And so one of those baskets is carbon dioxide removal technologies. So these are technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the ambient air. And so distinct from carbon capture and storage, which takes it from a point source, this is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere because the concentration of carbon dioxide is already too high in the atmosphere. This affects climate change because as we lower the concentration, that impacts the greenhouse gas effect. But of course, it works very slowly, and it's very costly to do. It's not really a question of if we're going to do carbon dioxide removal. All of the IPCC integrated assessment models that have any air of reality include in them gigaton scale amounts of carbon dioxide removal. And so the question isn't really whether we're going to do it, but how we're going to conduct carbon dioxide removal in a way that is sustainable and equitable and fair. CDR can happen on land. It can also happen in the oceans, and that has very different legal consequences depending on where it happens. And I'm happy to come back and talk about some of those as our discussion proceeds. The other basket of technologies are what are referred to as solar geoengineering. And so this isn't affecting levels of carbon dioxide, but is rather affecting the radiative balance within the atmosphere, usually by leveraging the albedo effect, and so increasing the reflectivity of elements within the Earth's atmosphere. So it could be cloud cover, could be in the upper atmosphere, in the stratosphere. But here the idea is to alter the amount of radiative energy that is coming into or staying within the Earth's atmosphere. And so it's not affecting the cause of climate change, but is rather affecting the result of climate change, in particular, global temperature. The ethics of solar geoengineering are very, very different because of the global scale, the degree of uncertainty, the sort of broad range of distributive consequences, and possibly the consequences that this kind of technology may have on our other attempts to manage climate change. And so what we sometimes call mitigation deterrence. If we have this solution, are we going to do less on things like emissions reductions, which we have to do? I think another useful discussion.
They usually call that the moral hazard.
The moral hazard is another way of talking about it. Yeah. And I think just finally, the other distinction that's useful to talk about, particularly in talking about solar geoengineering, is the distinction between research governance and deployment governance. And so SRM is what I would call a hypothetical technology. It's not a real technology. It doesn't exist. It's a set of models and understandings about how the atmosphere works. And so there's a lot of experimentation that has to be done, and we have to govern that research in a particular way, and that raises different issues than the issues around the deployment of something like solar geoengineering. And so sort of having sort of laid a bit of that groundwork, I'll perhaps turn it over to my colleagues to talk about some of the ethical issues.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody here have a strong position on these matters? I mean, is this anything you've ever argued about? And if so, what side are you on? We may as well find out where the battle lines might exist if they're.
Well, I have a very strong position on it, but I wouldn't say that it's an either or kind of thumbs up and thumbs down. I sort of wish it was, but I think it's a sign of the times and a sign of the rather desperate circumstances we find ourselves in, that it's very difficult to adopt an either fully thumbs up or fully thumbs down kind of approach to this, in my view, at least.
Then you want to make some differentiation between types or conditions.
Well, yeah. So picking up on Neil's initial distinction between carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management, as he quite rightly pointed out, there are two sort of baskets of technologies, numerous technologies within each of those baskets, and they do raise significantly distinct ethical concerns. We can come around to those, but let me just set them up by noting what they have in common, first of all, right? So they're both, when we ethicists talk about issues like this, it's often in the language of justice concerns. So we're worried about distributive justice and corrective justice. Both of these apply to the issue of geoengineering or climate intervention. So distributive justice is all about how benefits and burdens are spread within some politically circumscribed group, right? So in this case, what we're thinking of mainly, though not entirely, are the burdens, i.e. the harms that could come to some groups of people on account of the deployment of these technologies, right? Whether it's CDR or SRM. The issue of corrective justice is tightly connected to that, because if there are harms, then we need.
I'm going to try to remember to interrupt and give you the full terms when people use these acronyms, because I know my own mind often bogs. Now, what does he mean by that? I have to translate, and our
Okay.
viewers will certainly not quickly remember what CDR is. So, if possible,
I'll try
let's
and
say
not use the acronyms at all, okay? If I
you'll
can.
try to remember. Okay.
It's an academic vice. But I'll try not to do it, right? So with carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management, so Neil's two categories or baskets, there are issues of distributive justice, right? Like who benefits and who is harmed by their deployment, and then of corrective justice, right? So insofar as there are harms, how do we establish sort of protocols of accountability and compensation for those groups which are harmed? So that's the very abstract or general sense, I think, in which issues of ethics and justice apply to both carbon dioxide removal and to solar radiation management. Although, again, I'll reiterate that I'm totally on board with what Simon said, that when you get to the nitty gritty, there are important differences between the two. But maybe I'll stop there and let Simon.
No, don't stop, because I want to say, if you think that there are that the two baskets would lead to different decisions about when you should and allow when you shouldn't allow certain kinds of technologies, give us a preview of which ones you would like to give the green light to and why.
Okay. Okay. Well, there are a number of justice-related issues, but distributive justice with either, right? So let me just take kind of like one of each, right? So there's a justice issue with carbon dioxide removal. If we are talking about these things, any of those technologies, like for example, take bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, that's getting a lot of buzz in policy circles, right? So the basic idea is that we burn biofuels. And that removes their potential carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We grow them and then we burn them, but we bury the carbon dioxide. So I know you don't like acronyms, but that's BECCS, right? Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So the numbers are important here. And we should also mention afforestation in this context, right? The IPCC estimates that we would need 6 million square kilometers of additional land for bioenergy crops, right, to actually do anything to help solve the problem, and 9.5 million square kilometers for forests if we want to do anything about the problem via afforestation. So growing the feedstock just for bioenergy at scale means you've introduced massive competition among land use priorities, right? So the global north, now let's be realists about this, right? The global north is not going to allow its croplands to be converted to feedstock. So that means that areas covered by grasslands and pastures will very likely be targeted for conversion, but those are found overwhelmingly in the global south, particularly Africa, Central America, Central Asia, and of course, Australia. So there's a kind of colonial mentality at work here that we can simply use those areas in order to grow our biological feedstock for biological energy and carbon capture and storage. So there's a justice issue on a global scale with respect to carbon dioxide removal right there. With solar radiation management, things are different, right? One of the issues that I take it will come up again here is that even if we are successful, I mean, the technology in this basket that seems to be getting most buzz is sulfate injection. So this is the idea of injecting the lower stratosphere with sulfur dioxide particles, which are highly reflective of sunlight, and so you're bouncing sunlight back out into space before it has the chance to reach Earth and warm the Earth correspondingly, right? So the rough idea is to send fleets of airplanes loaded with sulfur dioxide to loft this chemical up into the stratosphere. So there are all kinds of issues associated with that, right? But if it were successful, it does nothing to stop the process of ocean acidification, because by hypothesis, unless you've also stopped emitting carbon. You've still got high levels of carbon in the atmosphere. You simply masked them with this sulfur dioxide kind of mask or veil. And so with very, very high atmospheric concentrations of carbon, that leaks its way into oceans and continues or even worsens the problem of ocean acidification. And there are massive problems, including the shutdown of fisheries, on which hundreds of millions of people are economically dependent through this process of acidifying the oceans. So there are two justice-related issues with each of the two particular technologies.
So, but now this second one has two dimensions. One is the risk factor, and the other is, the effectiveness factor, because we don't know how much harm. Well, none of these things have been tested enough, or so that people are really confident how much the risk there is and who will have to pay. But I think all of the technologies that depend on manipulating the albedo have the same shortcoming. That is, it doesn't do anything to stop the acidification of the oceans, and that has to be as urgent a problem. Well, maybe not as urgent as maybe the Arctic potential for exploding or something like that, but because that might be a faster catastrophe. I don't know, but at any rate, it's not something you can overlook and postpone forever. So, right? Yep. I think we would all agree that doesn't help. Yes.
Can I just pick up on a couple of those thoughts, Meta? Because I think what the most important word that Byron just used is the word mask. If we are serious about dealing with the problem of climate change, we need to think seriously about the causes, and the causes come from burning far too much stuff. And if we are serious about it, the ethical response is to stop burning stuff, because it's the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is heating and causing all the climate disruptions. And I think we need to be very clear about the problems with a lot of the solar radiation management. Argument is that we've got too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere; it's heating things up. Therefore, we need to shade the planet. The bigger problem then becomes a matter of well, if we start doing this and we don't cut back on burning stuff, we're stuck with needing to do this in perpetuity until eventually somebody figures out how to get those carbon dioxide levels down to something more reasonable. And the danger of the moral hazard point, I think, is absolutely crucial, because we need to make sure that we are focusing on the causes and tackle them quite directly. If you'll permit me a little bit of a plug for my latest book, it's called Pyromania, because we are addicted to burning stuff. We know we shouldn't do it, but our impulse control mechanism seems to be defective, and we continue to do it. We have to tackle the combustion problem first and foremost. Insofar as we are now in emergency circumstances, the argument is, well, we're so far into this, we desperately need to buy some time, and therefore we may need to put something in the upper atmosphere to act as the shade, to bounce the sunlight back. Then the question becomes, well, this sulfur is a real problem, because it turns into sulfuric acid when it combines with water. And then if that rains out, it simply makes the oceans ever more acidic. So the counter argument is, well, let's try and find some alkaline substance that's harmless, relatively speaking. And if we're going to do SRM, solar radiation management, by injecting something into the lower stratosphere, then let's at least do a chemical that will help with the ocean acidification. Then it's over to the chemists and the biochemists to figure out, well, is there actually something feasible that might do? But even if you're doing that, you're still stuck with the termination problem, as it's called in this game, which is you have to keep on doing it, because if you suddenly stop, then the spike in the Earth's temperature that would result very quickly would cause even worse chaos. So we are sort of ethically committed to it once we start it. And therefore, we've got the intergenerational ethics question. Are we, reasonably, sensibly inflicting this on our grandchildren? They'll have to keep doing it unless the Earth manages to and unless we manage to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the Earth system. And that's really the crucial question. It is much easier to deal with this by figuring out how to get energy for all the many things that humans need to do without burning stuff, without generating the carbon dioxide. Then you don't actually have the problem that Byron was just talking about in terms of where are we going to grow all these huge number of trees with all the other ethical and ecological consequences that come from massive tree plantations. And plantations are what we're talking about, and that takes us back to the whole history of colonialism. So we're stuck with a whole series of these things, but if you really want to get the ethics on it, you have to focus on reducing combustion quickly, so that we aren't actually having to then deal with the carbon dioxide. Don't make it in the first place. It has to be the crucial focus for all of this discussion.
Okay, boy, have you opened up a whole bunch of cans of worms. I don't know which one to tackle first, except I think at first I would want to call attention to the fact that the injection of sulfur into the stratosphere is not the only game in town, and that there are other ways of shading the world that have maybe more justification and scientific backing. So let's not act as if that's the only game in town. It's you can think of marine cloud brightening, for example, or other variety of other things that might help to shade the planet.
But it's also an important issue with respect to carbon dioxide removal. And one of the things that we risk is relying on carbon dioxide removal in the future. So what carbon dioxide removal does, right, is it decouples emissions spatially and temporally, right? So you can emit something and you can draw it back from the atmosphere in another location. That goes to Byron's sort of north-south issue, but also at a time later. And so the economic attractiveness of carbon dioxide removal is that as technologies improve in the future, we can rely more on more. And some of the models are showing like absolutely astronomical amounts of carbon dioxide removal in the future, sort of in the range of 10 to 20 gigatons annually, which is almost 50% of what we're currently emitting into the atmosphere right now, just to give you a sense of the scale. And so one of the, I think, legal responses that we can look at is restricting the degree to which states can actually rely on carbon dioxide removal and insist that they have minimum levels of emissions reductions. And so when states put their pledges forward under the Paris Agreement, one of the things that they can do now is sort of hedge their bets a bit with this sort of net zero world. And the problem with net zero commitments is they're very opaque. You don't actually know how you're going to get to net zero and what you're relying on. And I think one of the things that I've been interested in and writing on is, can we actually change the rules under the Paris Agreement to make it very clear that that carbon dioxide removal is supplemental and secondary to emissions reductions, and place limits on removals that match some of the things that the sustainability limits on carbon dioxide removal, the capacity limits, and maybe some of the distributive limits as well. So there are ways, at least in the carbon dioxide removal world, where we can possibly address these moral hazard issues, but they certainly exist in both areas.
Mm.
Right. Let me just reiterate something that Neil actually said at the outset, right? Which is that almost all low temperature scenarios in the IPCC's fifth assessment report, and this carries on to the Paris Agreement and everything after that, rely already on massive amounts of carbon dioxide removal to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. So some commitment to these technologies, whenever you hear governments like the government of Alberta or the government of Canada talking about, net zero emissions by 2050 or whatever, they don't always add to that they are relying on these so far purely notional technologies to get them there, but such reliance is already baked into those low targets, right? So we actually have to figure it out if we are to stay below 2 degrees Celsius, unless we are going to take more seriously the idea, which everybody seems to want to avoid, that we need to engage in massive kinds and amounts of behavioral change, right? So the idea that we could somehow change our lifestyles, right, change the Western lifestyle or standard of living, like put some downward pressure on it, just seems to be off the table now. And because it's off the table entirely, we get these vague, distant targets, 2050, right? Baked into them is the idea that there's a techno fix, essentially, right? Whether it's in the form of carbon dioxide removal or solar radiation management. But in those reports that I've been talking about, it's explicitly bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. So, to its credit, I don't say many nice things about the government of Alberta, but to its credit, it is actually being upfront about this, right? It is saying that its distant target, it is saying out loud that its distant targets are tied to the development and deployment of these technologies, although they don't talk about solar radiation management.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think that you've just told me something I didn't know, and I would like to have some quantification if possible. My impression was that the IPCC, for example, which represents states, not individuals, and states who tend to be very heavily influenced by fossil fuel companies, that they are actually avoiding any reference to carbon dioxide removal or any other form of geoengineering, if you will. That they are still in the throes of an ideology that says all we have to do is carbon emission reduction, and that we don't have to do anything beyond that, which is, by now everybody knows better than that if they want to talk about it, but they avoid the subject. Now, my sense is that when we talk about the moral hazard argument, it applies to some people, but I think we ought to be clear about who uses it, because it is an ideological tool. I think it's used by fossil fuel interests and is manipulated through governance. It's governments that send people and appoint people and control the IPCC, and they tend to avoid the subject and for obvious reasons. But I think the general public, it doesn't have that kind of hang up. I know that every normal person that I have ever met can understand that when your bathtub is about to overflow, you turn off the tap and pull the plug. And you should do both if you're sensible. And there's no contradiction between them. You don't have to think about which one you're allowed to do and which one would be a delusion about effectiveness. You know that you can both remove things from the atmosphere and stop putting more stuff into it. And normal people understand that quite readily. Anybody who says that it's a moral issue, I think, is in the hands of people who want to use it to be a moral issue, which it shouldn't be. But there we go. Here I'm on my soapbox. Neil, what is your opinion on that?
Well, I guess I'd come to the defense of the IPCC a little bit, because it's not run by states, it's run by scientists. Scientists are appointed by states, but it has a very robust approach. And I think it's been quite honest about the possible options that we have for achieving the Paris targets. And it identifies 4 climate responses, and 2 of those include carbon dioxide removal and solar geoengineering. And it's very clear that solar geoengineering is very uncertain, very risky, and at this stage, really not desirable at all. But I think is recognizing that carbon dioxide removal is necessary. I think I think one of the questions, and maybe it's the question that might be interesting to to turn to, and particularly around solar radiation management, because I think there might be some disagreements between us on this, is the extent to which we actually research solar geoengineering. And there has been a move among global governance scholars to say that this is a technology that is totally ungovernable, and there is no conceivable way that it can be deployed in a way that would meet any reasonable requirements of democracy and justice. And in light of that, and in light of the moral hazard, it is a technology that we should effectively abandon, and has called for a moratorium on research. Now, this is not coming from states. This is coming from, like I said, governance scholars, and I think it's an interesting position, but it's one that I have to say that I bristle against. And you asked us to sort of own up as to sort of where we stand on these issues. And I'm find solar geoengineering, as many people do, a deeply troubling technology for the reasons that we said. And it's very hard for me to understand how it could be deployed currently in what that technology looks like in ways that would be fair and just. I do not think that we should not continue to research these technologies. I think that we have to continue to understand them. I think that governance and technological development are coupled, that governance changes as the technology changes. One of the things we don't really clearly know is whether there are forms of solar radiation management that could be used on a regional basis. So is there a way of doing marine cloud brightening that could be more regionally centered? I think right now the evidence is that it would be difficult, but there are some local applications of MCB that are marine cloud brightening that are being explored. And so I think this question of research governance and whether we should research is an interesting one, and it's certainly one that has, I think, divided the scientific and the sort of social scientific community as to how we should proceed.
But just a minute. I mean, I think the question of whether to do research really has to be, you have to consider whether you think this research is itself going to be harmful, is a little bit going to cause a lot of trouble someplace. And I think the problem is we don't know how much risk there really is. You say that there's real risk. Well, I don't know how you know how much risk there is. That's the problem. We need to do more research precisely because we have hardly any clues as to what the actual harmful effects might be. Maybe I'm wrong.
I'll just quickly comment and turn it over to my colleagues. Yeah. And I would just say I don't agree that we can only focus on the physical impacts of research, that we also have to focus on the technological impacts of research. And by doing research and creating the understanding of a technology that we could then implement, we actually have to take that seriously. We actually have to take the sort of epistemic consequences of research seriously, and we actually have to be anticipatory. We can't just think we can do research and then decide that, perhaps this technology's not going to be sound. We actually have to think about whether the technologies we are developing in an anticipatory way are going to be sound. So I don't think just focusing on the physical aspects is sufficient.
Yeah. Can I just add to that? I mean, I think that I'm actually on board with much of what Neil has just said, and especially the sort of the guiding thought there that I don't think sort of like a moratorium on research is in order at this point into these technologies. And even if it were, right, sort of, even if from the moral standpoint it were justified, a moratorium, that is, I don't see how you could make it work, because this is like sulfate injection, at least, is something that is sort of so cheap, relatively speaking, that it can be done by any kind of rogue entity anywhere on the planet. We're talking about a group of individuals, a corporation, a state, a small state, anything. So I just don't see how you're going to keep this entirely under the hat, as it were, which means that it's got what research is inevitably going to happen should be subject to fairly strict and ethically constrained research protocols. The thing about most of these technologies is that it's one thing to run models from on a computer inside of a room that give you some information about what things might look like when the technology is deployed, and it's quite another to know how the physical world actually is going to respond. So doing research at a level that is going to be truly meaningful becomes barely distinguishable at that point from deployment. Like if you want to know how sulfates are going to work over the course, I mean, look, we got into talking about sulfates in the first place after the Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines in 1992, right? When massive amounts of sulfur dioxide were lofted into the stratosphere and then circulated throughout the globe, and then global average temperatures sort of cooled by something like 0.5 degree or more over the next year or so, right? So that's the level at which you're going to get sort of, as it were, actionable information. So but then you're deploying the technology, right? So that's the way we have to, I think, understand or talk about the research ethics in this particular context. The other issue about research that seems to me that we have to take seriously is that there can be a slippery slope between doing research on a topic and the deployment of whatever the technology happens to be, right? Because there are opportunity costs associated with, researching, putting massive amounts of resources into researching X. That comes with the opportunity cost of not doing research on Y, Z, etc. And you're in a kind of path dependency at that point, potentially speaking, right? So you do have to be aware of the fact that very high level research, highly resourced research in any of these areas will have a tendency to lead to deployment.
My 2 bits worth on this is sort of tangential to that, but it seems to me that the crucial question of this, and why I signed the no experimental research on this stuff petition a couple of years ago, is that it seems to me that the crucial question in all of this is who decides. The lack of any governance mechanism in place to monitor, to clearly communicate the results of these kinds of experiments seem to me to be a crucial issue that we needed to address. Some of these experiments are going to go ahead. Well, let's make absolutely sure that we have some kind of international governance mechanism, some kind of agreed set of rules of the road in place before we do it. Because one of the downsides of not doing that is we may well end up in serious conflict if we have a large scale, is an experiment or a deployment, to Byron's point, which is followed by a couple of odd weather phenomena in places that are growing a whole lot of food, and the government in whichever country is short of food blames the government in some other country for doing the geoengineering experiment. Then we've got all sorts of potential conflicts, demands for compensation. You wrecked our food supply, so feed us, or else. Those kinds of international conflicts could easily loom in the absence of some agreed rules of the road and some agreed method in which the results are as transparent and widely diffused as possible. And it's the governance question that it seems to me we're going to have to tackle. Unless we get serious about reducing the use of fossil fuels and quickly, it may even be too late for that. We're going to be faced with all sorts of demands to do solar radiation management of some sort or other in the next few years, and certainly in the next few decades. And so we've got to collectively figure out if this is going ahead, how do you manage it, and so that it doesn't become a potential for yet further conflict. And goodness knows we've got enough of that at the moment in the world without adding huge potential future issues. I did a paper with an Iranian doctoral student who was a visitor at the Balsillie School quite a few years back now. And we were trying to think through the environmental dimensions of the crisis at Lake Urmia in Iran. And one of the things that popped out of the political statements about it was that then President Ahmadinejad in Iran actually trying to blame European states that he said were using cloud seeding technologies to make sure that it didn't rain in Iran, to add to Iran's difficulties of an extension of sanctions effectively. Now, nobody took him seriously because it was quite clear that the Europeans weren't doing any such thing. But nonetheless, the potential to use hostile environmental actions by one state as a way of deflecting criticism for his failure to grapple with the crisis around Lake Hermia was a very, very obvious precedent for the kind of trouble we might well get ourselves into down the road. And this is why I think it's really important that we stop and think about the governance. The ethical thing to do is to think about governance, think about what kind of institutions, with whom represented, and of course the folks in the global south are in many ways most vulnerable to some of the consequences, particularly for food disruptions, and therefore should have a fairly substantial voice in this. And yet there's surprisingly little sort of global south discussion of this until perhaps recently. And I think that this governance, who decides, how do we monitor and think through perhaps compensations if there are unexpected consequences for the geoengineering experiments, all that stuff needs to be thought through in advance so that we know what the rules of the road are. There's established procedures to prevent future conflicts emerging, because they will probably emerge unless there are some very clear rules of the road. And I think that's one of the really big sort of questions of geopolitics for the next decade, which is only a very nascent stage at the moment. That said, let me just make one final comment on that. The best novel yet on climate change is undoubtedly Kim Stanley Robinson's The Ministry for the Future. And it's the best novel because it's a novel about how we fix this, which is what we all need to be focused on. And there is, in fact, a bunch of geoengineering in that novel. And I don't want to give too many plot lines away, because everybody who's listening or watching this video should be reading that novel if they haven't already done so. But the point is that one state actually tries it and nobody seems to be all that bothered about it. Then you contrast that with Neil Atchison's book Termination Shock, where some states get terribly upset about other states doing geoengineering, and you end up with attempts to deal with it violently. And so this is the big sort of policy agenda that we really do need to start thinking about, because if we start shooting each other over this, well, then it really is yet a worse series of crises that we're going to have to deal with in future generations.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just maybe react a little bit to what Simon said, and I think all of those questions that he's raised are absolutely the right questions around attribution, and I think we have to take the sort of geopolitics of climate intervention very, very seriously. I think where we maybe depart is on this question of how much governance we require before research, and the sort of degree of control in relation to the kind of research that is going on. And I think there are sort of small scale governance opportunities. And I think we also have to think of, we're going to be doing experiments around solar geoengineering, but we also have to do governance experiments as well to understand how some of the governance of this works. And so I think some very specific things are research registries. And so every field experiment and perhaps even encapsulated experiment needs to be disclosed, and in a very public way and in a very systematic way. And so one of the things that people have looked into is the use of research registries and whether that's a practical opportunity, but certainly normalizing that kind of high level of disclosure. this isn't abstract. The London Convention and London Protocol, which is the only international instrument that actually regulates geoengineering and regulates ocean iron fertilization. And what it does is it restricts deployment, but allows for small-scale experimentation, and attaches a series of conditions to the small-scale experimentation that meet the standard of what it calls legitimate scientific research. And it's things like disclosure, clear scientific methodologies, commitment to peer review, commitment to publishing all of your resources. And part of this idea is to ensure that when we have these debates, which we will have around governance, that they're informed by science that is broadly accepted because the science has been done in a way that people feel is open, transparent, and legitimate. And so I think, we actually have to think about governance in these sort of smaller steps. And then, but of course, as Byron pointed out, as we scale, then the governance challenges become much harder. But we might know more about the technologies and what they look like, and other opportunities may present themselves.
Yeah, the London Convention and what always comes to mind in these governance discussions are like sort of which existing treaties and conventions and so on can we kind of fit all this under, and the London Convention does come up, right, because as you point out, Neil, it's got this explicit reference to geoengineering. But that convention, as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is also brought up sometimes in this context, I mean, they do lack some international legitimacy, right? What is the London Convention has 90 parties or something? I mean, it's not that many, right? Compared to, say, the UNFCCC, which has universal ratification. So it might be easier to fit geoengineering protocols into the framework Convention on Climate Change. Especially since that talks about protecting the climate system in very nice general ways, about protecting the climate system for the benefit of present and future systems or generations and so on, right? So I don't know. It's a nitpicky question to some extent. Which existing regime governance protocol would fit best under? It's got to be one of those three, it seems to me, right?
Yeah.
The Framework Convention on Climate Change, the London Convention, or the Convention on Biological Diversity.
I mean, the London Convention is very constrained, right? It regulates depositions into the ocean. And so it fits ocean iron fertilization because that involves a deposition into the ocean. It probably fits ocean alkalinity. It probably doesn't fit marine cloud brightening because marine cloud brightening doesn't involve a direct deposition into the ocean. My view is that none of the existing institutions globally are clear candidates for regulating SRM on a large scale. I think doing it in the UNFCCC and the Framework Convention on Climate Change is not a great fit. There's really nothing in the Paris Agreement that looks, and we've looked at this, that could regulate solar geoengineering. There have been discussions at the United Nations Environment Assembly. There have been discussions and resolutions at the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they haven't been, in my view, particularly. They're non-binding, and they're and again are restricted to biological diversity. And so, I think it's a real issue, and I think it might be such a unique issue that we actually have to build up something new, and it is very hard to understand what the right analogies actually are, and thinking about what those analogies are, and also what the technological analogies are, right? In terms of is it nuclear, is it genetics, or something like that.
I'm delighted to see that everybody sounds like we all are good liberal democracy people, and good people for academic life. But I can imagine some of the people that I know, or that we all know, James Hansen, for example, if he were here, or if Peter Wadhams were here. These are people who might very well say, that would be very nice to be concerned about governance and to take it very seriously if it were not an emergency. But we are now in a situation in which the probability is that the actual effects of global warming are going to be so catastrophic and look as if they're so inevitable that the only thing that we can possibly do is a very urgent intervention with actually deploying more than one of these technologies right away, because we have to save the world, that simply. And then we'd have a different kind of conversation. If you take seriously the notion that there are tripping points that we're about to transgress, then the issue becomes framed differently. How urgent is this? How serious are the likely risks of doing and not doing some geoengineering? And we really don't know the answer to that. I'd like everybody's thought about that before we end this conversation.
So I think that I agree with the statement that we're in an emergency situation, but being in an emergency situation doesn't justify rash behavior, and ever, right? That's just a kind of a general claim. One of the things I think we need to remember in the context of discussing all of this stuff, right, is that we are I think it's correct to pose the moral problem of geoengineering as a kind of ethical or moral dilemma. Catastrophic global warming or climate change is a terrible thing, and geoengineering at scale just might be as well, for all we know, right? Certainly the solar radiation management version of it just might be as well. And so this is often cast as a kind of lesser evil argument, right? That as bad as solar geoengineering will be, it's not as bad as unchecked climate change or the effects of unchecked climate change. And so, when you're in a moral dilemma, nothing you do is right. And so to some extent that gets you off the hook. But it's really important to remember that there are two forms of moral dilemmas. There's moral dilemmas that the world puts us into, and there's moral dilemmas that we put ourselves into. And we put ourselves into this particular moral dilemma by our refusal since, pick the date, right? 1965, 1988, whatever, right? Like people will point to different dates in the past as the point at which we knew better about the profligate carbon emissions we were emitting. But whatever date you choose in the past, we've had plenty of time to correct action. Now we're in this particular state. So at the very least, we should be humble about our ability to deliberate and resolve issues like this in a rational and fully moral way. Because if we were as capable of that as we think we are, we wouldn't be in the dilemma in the first place. So I think even though we're in an emergency, that does not absolve us from trying at least to behave with some humility in this case. And behaving with some humility in this case means taking our time, because these are technologies that could be. There are so many unknowns and unknown unknowns that, deployment of them could be absolutely catastrophic for all we know. So this is my red line. We absolutely can't rush into this.
Thank you.
Couple of thoughts on that, Meta. The one thing that we haven't mentioned is really the question of who does this. It seems to me that it's absolutely crucial that this is done by civilian agencies, not the military. And of course, the military, with its logistics and equipment technology and its air forces and so on, might be the obvious agent to do it quickly. Mm-hmm. But I think that would be disastrous in terms of perception from other countries that are not involved. Hence my concern about the precedent. We do need to have a very clear discussion about if it's going to be done, it should not be done in a way that the military does, with all the secrecy and all that stuff. The other thing is that clearly in this case, there's all sorts of relatively benign things that need to be done. I love the white paint argument, because if you make roads white rather than black, they reflect a bit more sunlight. Folks in the Mediterranean realized that white houses made eminently good sense a very long time ago. Little things like that that are benign that would undoubtedly help. And I think, greening cities in terms of reducing car culture and rapidly expanding bike lanes, which are, of course, going to be white to reflect sunlight, right? There's lots of benign stuff I think all of those other things need to be done at the same time, in addition to rapidly reducing the use of carbon fuels. And don't get distracted from all of those benign other things that need to be done, which will have beneficial, relatively speaking, ecological consequences. But even with all of those measures in place, the current trajectories are alarming, which means we do need to maintain a focus on, if it comes to it, how do we do it relatively safely, relatively transparently?
Thank you. Okay, Neil, I think you have the last word.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also really bristle against this sort of emergency framing as a way of saying we have to do without sort of democratic and justice considerations. I don't think you can separate the two at all. I think Byron made the point early on, and it's one to remember, that so much of this is about allocation and distributive justice. And one of the things that we know about SRM from the models is it's patchy, that you don't just change the global temperature in some uniform way, that the models indicate that it changes in different ways, and there's potentially winners and losers, and perhaps as you can adjust the levels, you can influence that, but there's no way you can make decisions about that that aren't intrinsically and inherently related to sort of democratic questions about who decides and how it's decided and whose voices you hear. And I think these, when we think about who could do it, and I think the idea of the global north implementing some of these, whether it's CDR or SRM on the backs of the global south, ought to be something that we ought to be very, very concerned about. And I think it's highly destabilizing. And I just think the whole climate change is such a big problem that it's bigger than democracy. I think is a false set of arguments that makes a distinction that's not there. So I bristle against it. I think the only way we can govern this is with regard to democratic principles.
Thank you all. I think we've had a good beginning in this conversation. And over the next 8 months, we'll be listening to a variety of people with different perspectives, mostly technological concerns. But at the end, we're going to come back and talk about this very question again. What conclusions can we reach at that point? And there will be things going on in the real world in the meantime, too, real changes and developments that may influence public opinion on this question. So I'm very grateful to you for launching this conversation, and I'll be back in touch with all of you before too long. Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you
very much. Bye for now.
Project Save the World produces these forums, and this is episode 585. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. People share information there about 6 global issues, and we welcome your comments. To find a particular talk show, check the scroll list on the homepage or use the search bar. Project Save the World also produces a quarterly online publication, Peace Magazine, which now serves as a free-of-charge newsletter to help mobilize knowledge about 6 global threats to humankind. We gladly email the magazine as a PDF or link to any interested organization in the world that works to prevent a global catastrophe involving war and weapons, global warming, famine, pandemics, radioactive contamination, or cyber risks. Just email us at office@peacemagazine.org, and we'll add your group's email address without charge to our list. Please type "subscribe my group" as the subject of your email. For individual subscriptions at $20 Canadian per year, go to pressreader.com on your browser and search for Peace Magazine.